Yassa will be simple. Yassa is truly simple. Yassa has actually survived to this day in most of the former territories of Tsarist Russia, and people from both Russia and today's republics and satellites do not realize how much it left behind. It may not be visible in the mentality of the countries that constitute the borders of the European Union, but traces of Yassa can also be found here. After all, for centuries, the Tatars were the strong-armed arm of the local rulers, and it was these mercenaries who decided about the victories of battles. It is safe to say that the areas of medieval Russian principalities resisted the conquest, for example, of the Teutonic Order, which also saw the Orthodox Christians as dissenters, thanks to Yassa. Nevsky brought the Tatars. Jogaila used Tartars many times. List is very long. This simple law has always irritated the West. Before the rise of Temujin, there was only customary law known as Tor-Jason. We do not know how much of this law went to the Yassa and how much was influenced by Chinese and Byzantine law, but it certainly had some influence. We owe the name Yassa to Muslim people, and probably, like the European name Istanbul, it arose from a misunderstanding of the statement. So let us recall that the Turks did not change the name of the capital Constantinople until Ataturk's time. In fact, the Young Turks began to use this combination of words as the name of the city. Istanbul was created from a combination of Greek words as tin polis, literally, to the city. The French are mainly responsible for this word formation. Most likely, the European population, hearing the Turks' conversations during trade meetings, concluded with their wonderful ability of linguistic polyglotsy that this could be the name for the capital. Meanwhile, it was nothing more than the phrase, "We're going back to the city." Interestingly, Tsarograd is also nowhere to be found in Russia. This is a name for Constantinople, not Moscow or Petersburg. This is where Europe's ability to polyglot comes into play again. The Mongols themselves defined this law completely differently, but sometimes they also used the word yasuk, order, regulation. Yassa has not survived to this day. We only know those fragments that influenced the Muslim civilization and survived in that culture. So the question may be asked whether the Yassa might not be a Mongol's Yassa from the time of the emperor? No, in Temujin's time the law was less fancy and more simple. In fact, the legendary atrocities of the Yassa, which, as we will see, were not such at all, came many years after Temujin, when the Khagans became the masters of China. These elaborate tortures come from here. The Yassa we know is the law of the Yuan dynasty. The right of Kublai's descendants, but not of Temujin himself. Unfortunately, even respected publicists repeat these myths to this day. It seems as if no one wants to look into the archives of Russia or the republics. When it comes to this topic, are open. World War II is a problem for all the powers that divided the world. It was a set of customary law norms adapted to the needs of a rapidly developing country. Some legal articles could indeed be Yassa, because they come from the steppe and can be found in other cultural circles. Contrary to European stories, legal provisions did not affect the lives of every citizen in the same way. To make things funnier, European laws from that time also did not treat everyone equally. If a farmhand was hunting in the royal forests, he could be killed, but the prince would be fined. Today, famous people are also treated differently, although ordinary people claim otherwise. People have never gotten rich through hard work, and especially under capitalism they don't get rich. The Mongols absorbed the cultures of the nations which they conquered. In this respect they were like the Huns, to whom they are related. Some they worship, others respected, and some they did not respect at all. Khagans also had a different attitude towards rights, as they, thanks to their enormous interest in religions, actually practiced all religions in the world. As a result, the law also treated people related to the ruling family, tribal relatives, friendly groups, and strangers differently. If someone's behavior was contrary to traditionally applicable norms, the perpetrator was subject to punishment, which could take various forms depending on the position of the person or region. It was the Khan or Khagan who decided on the punishment. Over time, especially in the Khagan's court, we observe the emergence of something that can be called judicial supervision. This state authority, or a designated person, issues judgments. Interestingly, Yassa never interfered in family matters. Here everything was in the hands of the head of the family, his wife, or the family elders. Mongolian women had a lot of rights. They took part in politics, had the right to command the army, and at home even the Kagan had to take their opinion into account. They are true rulers of the family and home peace in the literal sense of the word, and their word is the last in many matters. Not much has changed in this regard. Just visit Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan or Mongolia. The Mongols, Kyrgyz and Kipchaks were destroyed as much as possible. They were forced to change their lifestyle, but they did not give up. Although there are certainly no gold empires to be found here, the spirit has not been broken. Family is still the most important thing. It is said that every Mongol seeks his Borte. Borte indeed had enormous power and influence, as well as respect. Even though she became pregnant by another man, Temujin recognized the child and raised it as his own. His biological sons were often jealous of the influence of their half-brother, who was nominated to be heir to the throne by Kagan. This was a precedent in the history of all Asian peoples, because such a woman should have been at least removed from sight. There was betrayal, although it was not Borte's fault, as she was kidnapped, but such women were still considered defiled and, in fact, could be cut off by a head. On the steppe, a woman belongs to one man. If the second one takes it, the previous one will not touch it. Europeans forget about this fact when talking about Temujin, but it is an important aspect, showing a loving man who certainly had to face the family's reluctance towards his wife and unfavorable views. It was a relationship of love. Although the West, as usual, knows its own thing. It has a different recipe for love. Sorry for say that, but I'll call it by name. Come quickly and leave. Most of them are not good for anything else. When they open their mouths, intelligence shines silver. In their case, silence is truly gold, or maybe even platinum, as say old saying. The West generally believes that it is tolerant, but somehow any current of thought that is even slightly different from the main one imposed by the Holy Empire is considered evil, and people do not even want to find out for themselves whether this is really the case. Or to delve deeper into the topic, they just keep repeating that it is evil. The moral teachings from the Spaniards, towards Islam, about how brutal the religion is, are quite funny. In the history of Christianity, there have been no more brutal followers of religion than them, who persisted with the Inquisition and torture long after they were legally dissanctioned. What is legalizing today? Zoophilia, which is even contrary to biological nature, although it can also be attributed to the love of bloodiness typical of this nation. They are the most powerful heirs of the Roman Empire in terms of culture by far. The main reason why Western civilizations were supposedly based on Roman law, although not always. Hate Yassa, it is in fact its simplicity and the fact that you really can't employ a parrot here that says you didn't kill it, even though you did kill it, or maybe this parrot comes from here. In fact, Mongolian law is more similar to modern European law than Roman law. Nevertheless, it was a simple law and it was difficult to avoid serious crimes, unless a blood brotherhood was established with the muzzle, which included a provision for forgiveness of 10 crimes. Most often, however, it concerned outstanding warriors and chroniclers. People who are simply necessary. Complex European law has created corruption and legal loopholes since Roman times, which was convenient especially for wealthy people. In Western law it was possible to convince. Even about the lack of marital life, Altuff pair had several children, and obtaining an annulment of the church marriage, although evidence of this marriage was circulating on the ground. This didn't happen in Yassa, but Yassa also created gates, and much better ones, which is why, contrary to appearances, it attracted people. As for the fratricide that Temujin is often accused of, although it was absolutely right in that situation we are talking about, the struggle for power took place both in the West and in the East. It was the West that played torture, masks, and water tests, while in Asia could at best be quickly beheaded or strangled with silk. Among the Turkic peoples, there is initially a bowstring. And we will return to the wonderful Spaniards again. Has anyone heard of Garakta? They also used a bowstring on the beginning, and then this fancy contraption. The last death sentence with a garrote was carried out in the 20th century. Yes, in the 20th century. At the end of the century. However, it was the guillotine that reigned the longest. This dull, missing guillotine. In 1981. How modern. Just peaceful people. People are nowhere peaceful, and although they analyze predators, no animal has patented as many monstrous methods of killing another as humans. Let us remember that the Mongols, like the Chinese and Byzantines, and the later Russian and Ottoman courts cannot shed noble blood, but there is no question here of other methods of shortening life. This is where the legendary bowstring or silk scarf comes from. If the Kurultai chose the Khan, power rested in his hands. However, it was not the Khan himself who passed the sentences. However, people were sentenced to death for disobedience, mainly during the war. In fact, in the so-called Western civilization, it has been and is the same for centuries. Disobeying an order during the war is punishable by shooting in this part, although few people remember about this and probably open their eyes in astonishment, which results from being too accustomed to the lack of war conflicts and also causing them, as the German Supreme Empress told, in a more cultured way. The law was and is applied. The codification of law is one of those things that Temujin started very early. Already in 1206, when he organized his state, expanded to include the lands of the Karaits and Najmans, he entrusted Kutuku with judicial matters, ordering the judgments to be recorded in the Blue Book. The Blue Book mentioned in the secret history is believed to be none other than Yassa. This confirms that Yassa was founded on the law of war. Kutuku also introduced the division of the country into principalities. The phrase, fist for fist, most closely corresponds to the European version of, an eye for an eye. Flogging and whips will reign throughout the world for a very long time. Yassa has been amended several times, and this fact means that what we know about her cannot be associated with Temujin. We can't because first of all, Europeans never met Mongols, but Tatars. It's time to end this alternating use of these two terms for two nations that are different in every respect. Batu Rayli ruled the horde, but it was most likely done peacefully through clientele. We have no data about the Tatar conquest. Batu became the ruler of this people, but the Tatars are far from the Mongols. Secondly, all wars with the Mongol Empire, thanks to which something about the Mongols could reach European ears, began after the death of Temujin and the amendment of Yassa. The first amendment was made before the expedition to Khorazm in 1218. The Mongols had already met the Chinese and defeated the Jurchens. Knowledge about the Yassa comes from Arab historians, but interestingly, each of them emphasizes that they have not seen a written Yassa. So our belief in this law is certainly wrong to some extent, if not entirely wrong. If anyone before Goebbels knew that propaganda is the most powerful weapon in the world, with which wars are won before the gun is fired, it was the Mongols, who mastered it perfectly for those times. The Mongols believed that the idea of universal peace lay under their supreme authority. They had a mandate from heaven, for they are descendants of Tengri. They are not alone in this idea. Let's not forget about Japan's Amaterasu and the chosen people. Latin and Reformed Christianity also perverted this concept at one time. The Crusades or the totalitarian state of Calvin, who was devoured by syphilis, are the beginning. In fact, all empires in history, or contemporary imperial institutions such as the European Union, understand order in this way. Only their views and perceptions of the world are right, they bring peace and give people a wonderful world, and all others are bad and it is best to destroy them, even if these views do not make the world wonderful and those of the other side may not be so bad. Someone will now say that people want to live in peace. To put it brutally, bullshit, people cannot live in peace. Mongolian diplomatic correspondence was mainly in the form of calm appeals to accept the authority of the Khagan. In many cases it worked, because customers were offered a very good deal. Some were unreal, such as Gujuk's letter to the Pope. Gujuk was certainly aware of this. It was an act for show. This does not mean that the papacy, and especially Outmar, did not use the Mongols in games in the Middle East. They did this quite often, although after Boudouin Lepre's death there was not really a ruler there with whom one could converse on the same intellectual level. Guy de Lusignan was already a political mediocrity. The further away, the worse. The Mongols never engaged in hostilities without prior agreement, an offer of recognition of power, or the fulfillment of demands. In the event of subordination, perpetual peace was guaranteed. This was understood as in Byzantium and the later Ottoman court, that is, until the death of one of the rulers who wrote the treaty. The Mongols had a much better attitude towards the steppe peoples than the sedentary ones. Their faithlessness, also resulted from the fact that this country, which was in fact a large army, had to be fed. The army had to have nourishment, and this nourishment is war. The second reason was the difficulty in establishing relations between the nomads and the urban population, resulting from a different mentality. Let's be honest, all over the world, the rural mentality is different from the urban one. Particularly strict norms of international law included the inviolability of deputies. This was common in Asia, but in Europe envoys and ambassadors were treated differently. The assassination of an envoy was always considered a declaration of war and resulted in an invasion. Talking about the murder of a nation for religious reasons, which unfortunately can be heard more and more often, results from a complete lack of understanding of the nation, or from studying only medieval propaganda incunabula. Yes, there were several nations in history that rebelled so often that they were decimated and they professed some religion, but the Mongols never engaged in religious war. It is a joke here that the Latins, although they slander the Mongols, at the same time believe that the Khan is the legendary Fisher King, protector of Graal. Some believes that Temujin searched Graal. I think that in that moment of history he needs something more standing on the ground for his nation. According to Yassa, the empire was headed by one of the descendants of the founder of the empire, chosen by the Kurultai. Of course, there was bribery to get as many votes as possible and take power. In this way, the ruler became a hostage of the Kurultai, and consequently of the army whose commanders formed the Kurultai. In the state, each subject was expected to fulfill his duties perfectly. This is characteristic of all peoples of Asia. These people strive to do everything they do with utmost perfection. This is more of an inheritance from the Chinese than a Yassa invention. Yassa devotes most of its parts to military affairs, which is understandable. There is even a fragment about the division of spoils. Interestingly, Yassa is also one of the first laws with regulations aimed at protecting game. In Europe, the first law of this type is English law, with its famous deer protection. However, as a result of the extermination of wolves and lynxes, these animals ceased to have a natural enemy in nature and literally ate the Scottish foothills. Scotland's mountains used to be covered with forests, but today they are bald. The British government is actually begging for the reintroduction of wolves and lynxes. It was doubtful the blonde empress would have thought about it since the wolf had dared to attack her pony. A pony, of course, not behind a fence, because if there was a fence, compensation would not be paid, often much greater than the value of the animal. After all, she's a blonde, and a German blonde at that. The Mughals established what in today's law is called an annual shooting limit and introduced a closed season for hares, fallow deer, wild goats and deer. Some nobles and steppe inhabitants were exempt from this. In the first case, it is obviously a scam, but in the second case it is absolutely right, because it is really difficult to find food on the steppe. Permits were also issued for owning hunting dogs and birds. Let's stop for a moment at the legendary eagle hunts that continue to this day. The Mongols are accused of stealing birds from their nests. I always wonder where the environmentalists are when zoophilia is legalized. Somehow they disappear when they are needed most. Yes, you take one bird from a nest, but from a nest where more than one chick has hatched. You take away the weaker chick that the brother or sister would kill anyway. This is the law of nature in these species. They are only taken until the breeding season and then released. In fact, these well-fed birds, which were sentenced to death at birth thanks to training and, consequently, better nutrition, win the lottery. Because they can hunt much better than their wild brothers, and can also fight with larger animals, and get a better meal. They become stronger and they are mostly the ones who will find partners, not their siblings. In fact, the Mongols are doing the world a favor. We will mention wolves another time. This is definitely the nation of the wolf. A nation that understood nature and knew how to manage it with reason. In the West, it has been doing poorly, especially in recent years. And so we have herds of wild emus, raccoons, hundreds of aquarium fish in rivers, and even kangaroos, because someone bought them, had no idea how to take care of them, and kangaroo farms were fashionable, or the emus were released and, unluckily, they multiplied. Which was to be expected, with a bit of intelligence in the brain. The administration, due to the overall functioning of the state, was closely linked to the military division. Commanders were responsible for order in the encampments of the territory subordinated to their unit. It was also aimed at ensuring that all roads in the country were safe, thus supporting the commercial development of the Silk Road. Yassa is very protective of the steppe and places more responsibilities on the settled peoples. Persecution of clergy and religious beliefs was punished, which Europe still has a problem with today, and one could even say that it goes from one extreme to another. They once murdered in the name of religion, because it is worth remembering that Protestants also built stacks. Today he does everything to discredit any religion and introduce old Roman debauchery instead. Of course, it is easier to rule people without any principles, especially when those at the top of power actually have nothing to offer and are occupied by individuals who have reached the height of incompetence. Penalties included murder, theft, adultery, sodomy, and repeated declarations of bankruptcy, which would also be useful today. The creators of paper money noticed that it could be a way to get rich and scam people. Can you be offended at the Mongols for punishing witchcraft with death if it causes misfortune? At that time, Europe was burning people a lot, even because of a mark on their face. The death penalty was primarily prescribed for betraying the Kagan. Informing, so revered especially in companies these days, was severely punished. Not only by the Mongols, but by every wise ruler in history who accomplished something and realized that if someone betrayed once, he would do it again. Alexander the Great listened to Bessus and then beheaded him and told him directly what he was dying for. Wise people get rid of informers, and weak people breed them. Yassa is military law and should be understood as such. You just need to read the preserved texts to understand this. There is constant talk about soldiers and officers. Mutilating thieves was nothing new, especially in the Middle East or Byzantium. Contrary to appearances, this has had a positive impact on these societies, because they show much greater respect for other people's property. An interesting fact is that for the killed person, the perpetrator had to pay the family a fine, which depended on the status and origin of the victim. Muslims achieve the greatest value, but is it really true? We know about Yassa from peoples who profess Islam. Perhaps they wanted to increase their rank. We know, after all, that the Mongols, like most peoples of Asia, draw heavily on Chinese culture and even make their court similar to it. Interestingly, Yassa punished people for failing to provide first aid, and we can safely say that countries that have such legal provisions draw on this codicil, because it is nowhere to be found in other old legal provisions. This has always been a controversial provision, because it has long been known that more harm than good can be done, and then the provision becomes unintentional manslaughter. The provisions on the death penalty for excreting feces and urine into water are often ridiculed. It seems that some book authors and so-called scientists slept through history or biology lessons in primary schools because they forgot what cholera comes from. Let's not forget that the Mongols have dealings with both Byzantium and China. Their medical knowledge is at a higher level than that of Europeans at that time and indeed later. Before visiting the doctor, Napoleon asked, "How many have you killed?" It was a really justified question. The Mongols could observe a lot on the steppe. This provision still applies in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. You can really get sick from the water there. Dirty water has always been the biggest problem for all living creatures. The largest list of uses of the death penalty is provided by al-Umari. However, we cannot believe this completely. It is no secret that the historical books of that time were not actually created with future generations in mind, but were intended to spread propaganda among the living and build a national myth. Especially when we talk about descriptions of battles and casualties, the numbers are greatly exaggerated and sometimes brought to such an absurdity that a given nation should actually no longer exist. No one counted dead bodies, but wrote a fanciful, large number that would make an impression. The bigger the better. You can practice either martyrology or glory. The Mongols did not even try to correct these numbers in their chronicles. In a sense, they rightly assumed that such texts would serve them better, and many nations would prefer to pay tribute just thinking about the mentioned numbers rather than go to war with them. It worked. The chronicles falsified data both in the East and in the West, especially in this matter. Chronicles have been doing this for a very long time, and in fact it is only recently that we have been writing history without hypocrisy, because we have the opportunity to use foreign books for scientific purposes. the truth in history does not help much in building national glory. We don't like historical truth. Oh no, some of Yassa's rules have become part of savoir vivre, such as the prohibition to start eating before everyone is seated at the table. According to Yassa, food should not be thrown, it should be given by hand and should not be done contemptuously. It was Yassa who introduced to medieval Russia, its republics and satellites, the famous superstition of stepping on the threshold or greeting each other on the threshold. Often we do not even realize what we inherit from our ancestors, even if it is extremely stupid. What harm could a threshold do? The most interesting knowledge that the Arabs gave us about the Mongols was their aversion to water. They are not to wash their hands, but rather take water into their mouths and spit it into their hands. The Mongols were definitely not supposed to wash. We'll probably never know what that wash was like, but it couldn't have been that bad. The Mongols could seem dirty to Arabs or Seljuks, if only because they wore mostly leather. The Tatars handed over the banya, mean bathhouse, which so eagerly conquered the world of Great Russia, to take root in this part of the world permanently. The regulations about not urinating in water seem to belie the Mongols' ignorance on the matter. People in their times were generally not very pure anywhere, but this is truly a Luciferian fragment that contradicts itself. The Xiongnu, who are known as Huns in Europe, have already been portrayed as dirty. It was pure propaganda intended to distinguish the barbarians from the so-called civilized Roman population. The Mongols certainly used water. And in Temujin's time they fought even in the storm, which really made them the leaders of the steppe, because until then no one had not fought there in rains. This little thing had a huge impact on how things turned out. What is surprising among contemporary authors is the lack of understanding of the provisions on collective responsibility, even if they should remember such times, but perhaps for some reason they do not want to remember. It's as if they forgot about German regulations from World War II or Soviet regulations during Stalinism. An entire village could be killed for hiding a Jew, and the Holodomor was nothing more than a punishment for the uprising in defense of the Romanovs, which was incited by, among others, Germany to then leave people to their own devices. If Yassa were a law also applicable in times of peace, it would mention property or family law, and Yassa does not discuss these issues at all. So how did the Mongols live in areas where there was no war? Nobody really knows this. We only have fragments about the fact that if someone did not have a family but had a guardian, the inheritance was due to that person, provided that they fulfilled their duties in a dignified manner. European law is not so generous in this matter to this day. Yassa was officially intended to be the final source of solutions to legal disputes and to be read before the beginning of the Kurultai. What do historians who did not give in to the denigration of the Mongols and their allied nations, as well as war strategists, think about Yassa? Contrary to the views of extreme scientists, who are a bit like extreme political parties, and therefore people with extreme views, in the real world, unfortunately, nothing is white or black. That's 255 shades of gray. Only a few nations on this earth blindly follow and do whatever they are told. One is most famous for this, but it does not live in Asia, but in Europe. Most people, however, can think for themselves, although especially in recent years the authorities have been doing everything to change this. In the initial period, the Mongols could not use fancy punishments or torture. There is no such information. To build such a huge empire, it was first necessary to unite people. Temujin may not have heard of Alexander the Great, but he certainly heard of Attila. People followed him because in his country there was no corruption, bribery and many other worms that plagued Rome. Orestes, his most faithful servant, was a Roman. He remained so loyal to Attila that after his death he returned to Rome and did everything to ensure that Romulus Augustulus took the throne. Romulus was the son of Orestes. Then agreements were made with Odoacer, who was to enter the empire to remove the corrupt Romans from power and bring about the fall of the sick creation. Odoacer betrayed him, but Attila's dream came true after his death. Unfortunately, in history textbooks we only find a note that Odoacer entered Rome, but no one mentions that it was at the invitation of Orestes and his son. People will learn about it in college, or they will never discover it. Temujin tried to be fair in distributing the loot, which endeared him to the officers and, consequently, to the army. Unlike Jamek, he did not impose harsh punishments unless someone betrayed him. Punishments became more elaborate after the empire was born, long after Temujin's departure. Many of them, such as the wrapping in a felt cloth, do not belong to the Mongols, but come from the peoples that became part of the empire, mainly from China. Temujin rewarded his allies with exemption from 10 penalties in advance for 10 subsequent offenses, should any occur, so it pays to be in the court of the Kagan. As proof, let us mention people such as Borchu, Shigi Kutuku, Makali, Jelm, Botokal and Sorkin Shira. These people have really sinned a lot in their lives by taking advantage of their privilege. While still living on the steppe, the Mongols knew the procedure for judicial investigations. The first investigators appeared in Mongolia and China. They were called Yargu. It is also here that something similar to today's courts appears for the first time, with the equivalents of lawyers and judges. If someone somewhere came up with a parrot telling us what a wonderful person this criminal is. Who has gone astray is this part of the world. To put someone on trial, evidence and testimony were needed. However, as everywhere, confessions were extracted through torture. Rubruk mentions it, but he reached Mongolia many years after Temujin's death. This is no longer the world of the Mongols, but of the Yuan dynasty. Europe told tall tales about the Hans and the Kagans, but somehow everyone wanted to meet them. Messengers are being sent to the Mongol court, although they will already reach Kublai Yuan's court. Long before Marco Polo, we have Benedict the Pole, Wilhelm Rubruk and many others. Legations are sent by emperors, but also by less important princes who dream of the Khan coming to their aid in solving the political problems of their principalities, such as Conrad of Masovia. A valuable, historic crown decorating the reliquary of St. Sigismund, which is one of the few princely crowns from Romanesque period that have survived unchanged in the world to this day, was supposed to be a gift for the Kagan. Women on the steppe have always had a high position. They could have been regents. The mother's word was final. Women could and did command armies. The most famous female warrior is Katulun, daughter of Kubilay's cousin Kaidu. Marco Polo met her. This issue distinguishes the Turkmen nations from the Arab ones. In Arab countries, the position of women largely depends on the men in their families. Here, a woman has had a strong position from the very beginning. The Turkmen were similar in that case with nations of steppe. The Ottoman court even sanctioned these laws by creating Valide Sultan institutions. The first feminists in history were born on the steppe, many years before European women began to dream of the right of inheritance. The Mongols are a class society, so subjects have obligations to pay tribute. However, these dependencies are not based on land, as in Europe, but on kinship. It's Alba, not Yassir. People of simple status are obliged to it. In times of peace, subjects participate in the raid and perform various activities on the agriculture. So where does the word Yassir come from? To this day it is difficult to determine. The monstrous Mongols become more civilized when you get to know them better, and their law is actually not much different from the law of civilized China. The monstrous Mongols never actually reached Western Europe. The Tatars, who were once known as the Pechenegs, have something to say here. Polovtsians are Kipchaks. The most common religion among Tatars is Islam or Orthodox Christianity. The Tatars most likely entered into a client relationship with the Mongols. Although their ruler was Batu, the two nations are not related to each other. For centuries they served as mercenaries to European kings, and their war tactics often tipped the scales of victory. Only some parts of Russia can claim to have encountered Mongols. One thing is certain, nations that have dealt with Yassa have as good memories as elephants. Here, a very comfortable Christian approach to life with forgiveness is rarely acceptable. After sinning, it is not enough to say sorry and everything will return to normal. Even if they are Christians. The Orthodox did not pervert the trade of indulgences to the extreme, which over time became common in the Latin West. The very living conditions forced people to have a good memory of both good and bad things. The legendary Russian or steppe hospitality is by no means a myth, because the people of the steppe, especially during the last war, proved that even though they have little, they can share. Here, two guests can truly be treated with everything what hosts have at home, and even go into debt on this occasion, although this is changing. It doesn't change on the steppe and probably won't change, because you can't survive on the steppe without a helping hand. They will soon say that the Germans fed them during World War II just to please them. Although the exodus from Siberia went through Iran and the republics. However, you should not forget that if you offend someone from these areas, there will be consequences for you and next generations to come. Is it good? Yes. It teaches people that they should think before they say something, and that spilling garbage and feeling unpunished is pointless. It teaches responsibility for actions and words. An oath is still an oath, not, "I'm sorry, I changed my mind." In the West, there is no such responsibility. What if? Well, don't scorn a weak cub, he may turn into a brutal tiger. It's the Western equivalent, revenge tastes cold. People have learned to wait for the right moment and take advantage of it. In fact, in all parts of the world, people become what they are fed when they are young. Upbringing, or lack thereof, family, school, treatment by friends, and surroundings create our psyche. This is why the West now has problems with some second-generation immigrants. They were fed with a lack of prospects, taught that they were good for cleaning and only for cleaning. There were no opportunities for development. I've never been a fan of novels. However, one strand of literature has always interested me, wuxia. Wuxia, in the West, is perceived primarily as martial arts films. These are often film adaptations of novels with a quite deep message of Asian philosophy. My dearest late partner always said that if you moved these European governments to Japan, most politicians would have to commit seppuku and the governments would perish. That's true. Responsibility for words is important even for many in Russia, more so beyond the Urals, but it is there. My favorite book is Kunlun the Slave, known under the movie title, The Promise. The book and the film refer to legends about the creation of geographical lands in China, but there is also a morality story. Very important. Each of the characters swore something. They swore a little without thinking. And everyone had to pay the price, either of fulfilling the oath or perjury. We must remember our debts of gratitude. And if someone has helped you, it is your duty to help them someday. In the West, even if it comes to this help, it must be profitable. Tax deduction, good image. It's self-interested, and that's not what helping is. If there is an idiot who does it like the step, selflessly, he must take into account that when he asks for help, the gates of the gilded men will be closed. They help when they have a business in it, and you've already helped them become gold-plated. Here, even families can avoid someone poor on the street because they don't fit the image. Check the surnames of oligarchs. It's not a secret that their nationality is different to citizenship. Here it rise to the pyramid. That part of society changed in bad way. Gilded people. The tiger is a symbol of all nations living in Asia. In Russia and for the Mongols, it was initially a wolf. The wolf is still a deity in the shamanic religion that has survived. The wolf is important to the Mongols. It is said that they have a double soul, a wolf and a tiger. When the Mongols met the Chinese, they also took over the tiger, and therefore the Russians too. They're tigers. It happens that you can interact with a tiger, but you need to know how to do it. We don't know what rights the real Yassa had. We take certain assumptions for granted, but the fact is that these principles of social coexistence in Asia, as well as in the larger territory of Russia and the republics, are still the basis for social functioning. It was created from Chinese, steppe and Byzantine law. Everyone is attached to the Pope. There is an episode about media manipulation. The text was taken out of the statement tendentiously. It was about a fragment of Yassa. Respect freedom of religion. If Pope Francis was referring to something, which, as usual, was received badly by those who ridiculed any religion, except one called anarchic atheism, it was this fragment of Yassa he was referring to. Indeed, under no other system has there been religious freedom for centuries. Yassa didn't look at someone's religion, only a person's skills. Freedom was never the result of someone's religion, although some people try to claim that it was the result of political conflicts. The Mongols eagerly invited followers of different religions to the court and discussed their views, and even several Khagans rightly noticed that religions came from the same stream when they talked about heaven. Interestingly, this was not approved by religious leaders, but not by Khagans. The Mongols will continue to demonstrate religious syncretism until the end. They choose from each religion something that suits their lifestyle, but they do not condemn anyone for their religious choices. Shamanism still plays an important role here. Yassa had a huge influence on Ottoman law, especially because people from Derwishmi with skills could make a huge career in the country, which they would never be able to do in their own country due to the lack of blue blood. In a sense, the Sultan is a hostage of the army, just like the Khagan of the Kurultai. Yassa is also connected with the Tatars, the Kipchaks, and in many respects with the Chechens. Most people in the world have the Genghis Khan gene. The second is Attila's gene. I emphasize the gene, although sometimes you can read the offspring, especially on the internet. Genetics doesn't always mean offspring. These people are simply genetically similar, which means that they can be considered to be descended from one ancestor or family tree. This does not mean, however, that this ancestor was Genghis Khan, but that they come from one genetic tree from Mongolia. Talking about offspring is a bit like saying that the father is responsible for the fact that someone was born a chimera because it is related to the Y chromosome. This also requires a process in the uterus of partial or complete absorption of the twin. This does not change the fact that Temujin's descendants are still alive today. However, Khagans play an unofficial role. The tiger is a symbol of all nations living in Asia. In Russia and for the Mongols, it was initially a wolf. The wolf is still a deity in the shamanic religion that has survived. The wolf is important to the Mongols. It is said that they have a double soul, a wolf and a tiger. When the Mongols met the Chinese, they also took over the tiger, and therefore the Russians too. They're tigers. It happens that you can interact with a tiger, but you need to know how to do it.